Right, well, we might kick off with some introductions. I'm sure the numbers will climb as people get their cups of coffees and cups of tea. But welcome to everyone and this UKAA seminar webinar sponsored by Quadient. Thank you very much, John, and your crew. My name is Leslie Roberts. I'm president of the UKAA as well as executive director of Allsop Letting and Management and a partner at Allsop LLP. I've been involved in the sector for 16 odd years, and I know quite a lot of these people on this lovely call this morning and have worked with them over those periods of time. So today I'm chairing a webinar on how the pandemic has impacted the future of apartment living. And joining me in alphabetical order is Ellis Hocken-Boyers, which is a fantastic name, from Rowdy Studios. Ellis is our client partnership director there, and he focuses on how brand can help boost and deliver results commercially. And we welcome your inputs today on the branding and marketing side and that perspective, which is ever so important from the consumer's point of view. Thanks, Next in line is James Partiger. And James is the senior advisor at Global Apartment Advisors, 25 years in the resi sector, and doesn't look like he's been here that long. And James, I'm just joking with you. So no. I always appreciate your perspective, James, on helping inform and educate why the sector is important and how it can help people at varying stages of life and increase and enhance the choice of housing types that we have. And you've got some great experience in that area, so welcome. Next in the J's, we have John Hammond from Quadient, the head of real estate for parcel locker and solutions in the UK and Ireland. And John's particularly interested in amenity-led services and the rise in deliveries over the pandemic, and is going to give us some good insight on that. Michael, oh gosh, I can barely say Swakowski, let alone can you tell me?
Yeah, Biszczowski. Thanks, Leslie.
There you go. And I won't try that one again. Is director of architects Chapman Taylor, the man in charge for the UK resi sector for Chapman Taylor, specialising in build to rent, and does a lot of work advising and promoting the sector. So thank you for that, Michael. And last but definitely not least is our lovely Russell Pedley from Sale Architecture, who's been in this game for probably longer than most, 30 years, I think. And you've been an architect for all of that time, I assume, and 13 years in urban design. Co-founder and director of The Sale, which was one of the architects that led the way in the first days with essential living, and has a lot of perspective in this area, as does Michael. So welcome to you all. So today we are talking about, and before we go on, we are recording this, so questions and answers, please put them forward from the crew who are listening in. We will take questions and answers after we've done a bit of a round table, but also interested in perspectives throughout. So if you want to put some chat on the sides, that would be great, and I will do my best to manage that as well. So, and we will be closing and finishing at 11 a.m. sharp. We've got some nice discussions to be had before then. So, first question to the crew. In the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, what changes have you seen for residents in apartments, and what are residents saying they're looking for in an apartment living from their community and their management teams and their design? Do we think that these changes are the short, medium or long term? So who's going to put their hand up first? James, over to you.
Go on then. Yes, well, thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here, and it's I hope we can have a great discussion. I think apartment living, as with so much of the sort of pandemic effects, has really sort of accelerated some of the trends that we were seeing anyway. And I think that is, whether that's with people's living arrangements, whether they're working arrangements, or their shopping arrangements, a lot of aspects of life have changed slightly, but I don't think many of them were a total surprise. They've sort of accelerated what we were doing. And for a relatively young sector such as build to rent and sort of purpose-built, purpose-managed apartments, I think that has really shown for people who are living in those the benefits of those far more quickly and far more strongly than might have otherwise been the case. And I think in that, I think it's also important to put the context in there that there's no type of housing that suits everybody at every stage of their life. But for people who are, I think there are a lot of people who through the pandemic have felt less secure in all sorts of ways, whether that's in terms of their job security, whether it's in terms of the makeup of their household, whether it's in terms of the location in which they want to live. And I think people are realizing pretty quickly, actually, now that we've got much more operational communities coming onto into operation, that this is a sector in which the residents have control over what they choose. They have choice, they have flexibility, they have security, and they can stay as long or as short as they want in a really good quality place. And I think that's something that it's just reinforced to me the message that we've, as a sector, been trying to get across for at least 5 and probably more like 10 years, is that the rental sector in the UK is huge. It always has been, but it's been very fragmented, and actually it's led to some bad experiences for people, and this is showing people what a good experience in renting can be. So at times in your life when you need to rent, why not do it as well as you can? And I think this is what the sector's been able to provide. So in terms of specifics, it's about maybe the amenities being offered within each community are slightly different. Maybe it's about the apartment sizes that people are choosing are slightly different, and we can discuss all these things in a bit more detail. Maybe even the furniture that they require is a bit different because they're working from home more than they were. But I think anecdotally, some of the I always used to say the best amenity that most renters in the UK could want was a landlord that answered the phone, and now we've got communities in which something much better than that is there because there's usually an on-site team of people you can get to know, who you can talk to, you make you feel part of the community, bring people together, provide that security and that service to people as and when, to what extent they need it, and that is very reassuring to people who are living in those apartments. I mean, there's lots more to say about the detail of that, but I'll hand over to someone else for the time being.
So, just from my own experience of managing an operating company and the experience that we had, there was a lot of, basically what's happened is we've leapfrogged the proof of concept very quickly, because actually what happened is people went to ground in terms of their living environment. That was the most security that they had during periods of uncertainty. So we saw this huge outpouring of sense of community and sense of reliance on the properties that they lived in, and how the industry responded to that was very positive. So Michael, just from your perspective, what do you have to say on the topic? What have you seen?
Yeah, well, good morning, and yeah, completely agree with the points made by James and yourself, Leslie. I think what was really encouraging as we look back on it now and reflect about that immediate aftermath of when we went into it, there was almost an assumption that people who were living within apartment buildings and multifamily developments in city centres were probably going to be at a slight disadvantage when lockdown happened. But I think it's exactly because of those points that you and James have touched upon that actually Build to Rent has been a bit of a silent hero or a shining knight through the process, because that focus of not just being a landlord who picks up the phone, but actually providing a hospitality-led, experiential-driven kind of concierge level of care for people has been, absolutely fantastic. And again, that's been suitable for people at different points in their lives who are living in these buildings. So if people were living on their own and they were forced to isolate, they were able to be looked after, they were able to have their food brought up by the kind of operator, they were able to interact with people using the kind of residence apps, they were able to do online cooking courses with their friends within the building. And I think that level of community ethos, which is behind BTR, was something that helped people kind of respond to the pandemic and some of the struggles with the kind of isolation. And again, there's lots of anecdotal examples where empty apartments were then given to people who needed to get a bit of space away from their particular apartment, whether they had children or whether there was kind of collective childcare arrangements. scheduled and controlled uses of the gym and the different amenities meant that people could still get on with some sense of normality of their lives, despite these massive kind of imposition on their movements. But I think, again, one of the biggest things, and that was, necessarily a knee-jerk response to comments about space standards and apartment sizes, access to balconies and outdoor space. A lot of those have been necessarily kind of short to medium term, I think, and the fundamental principles of how we live hasn't really changed too much, with the exception of working from home, because I think the working from home element is something that is likely to be a little bit more long term. And that's definitely not saying we're going to see it to the extent that we've had recently. We do believe that people are going to naturally gravitate towards city centres and are going to recognise the benefits of collaborating and being with their colleagues in person. So we believe people are going to start to have much more of a hybrid way of working. So it's understanding about how that work from home response starts to influence how we design these developments in the buildings. And again, we can start with the apartments and the core product. And like James touched upon, we're also seeing a trend where previously we would make sure the dumbbell typical 2-bed 4-person arrangement had an equal sizing of bedrooms, whereas now 2-bed 3-persons might become more popular to those people who want to turn a second bedroom into an office, but they don't necessarily want to do that with an oversized bedroom and so on and so forth. So I think the challenge for us as designers and architects hasn't really changed. It's about designing space with flexibility in mind, allowing the customers to take ownership of that space and curate it in a way that suits them. And so that won't necessarily change. But then once we come out of that apartment, because we still, in order to create true communities and neighborhoods, we want people to interact outside of their apartment buildings. So they can still retreat to the apartments if they need to make private phone calls for work or jump on a Zoom or Teams call. But we're hoping to see the amenity flex and evolve towards a more kind of co-working led environment so that people can engage with others within those buildings and work from home within the building. So again, sleep in the apartment, but live in the rest of the building. So I see that very much developing and being something that we pay more attention to as we move forward. And as ever, this isn't anything new for, as we've mentioned before, a relatively immature market as ours, because the challenge for us has always been predicting where the market's going to be in 3 to 4 years' time by the time the doors open. So we always start off making sure we got the core principles correct and we have that flexibility built in, and then we can respond to the trends in the market later on. And obviously the trends that we're seeing post-pandemic, some of them are short to medium term, but like I say, I think some of them are going to stick with us a little bit further. And again, there's some massive benefits from seeing people work from home when it comes to operating these larger multifamily developments, because there used to be a typical exodus at 9 a.m. in the morning, everybody leaving to go to work, and then there'd be an influx at maybe 7 p.m. or kind of earlier in the day. Whereas now it's much more fluid, and that building is no longer empty during the core part of the working day because of people's patterns are changing. And I think that, again, can only help with the placemaking agenda that, Build to Rent very much has at its heart.
So I'm going to come to Russell to talk to you about some of the points Michael raised there, just in terms of the usability of that space and the dwelling time and the intensity. And then I want to kind of move across to John and how amenities can help with that, and amenity provision and maybe technology and so forth. And then move across to Ellis on actually how the consumers perceive all of this and how we actually create a brand. So Russell, just basing on what Michael was saying about the flexibilities of space, and I'm particularly interested around this, now that we don't have this mass exodus at 9 o'clock and occupation back at sort of 7 o'clock in the evening, and these spaces have to work harder. There's potentially more, from an operator's point of view, those amenity spaces potentially, and the units have to work harder. How does that impact on the future of apartment living and design? How do we do that, not just apartments, but these build-to-rent developments in urban spaces? How would you approach that from an architectural point of view?
Yeah, there was a couple of themes picked up there by James and by Michael. And one that James particularly was choice, is having a choice. And in terms of the design of these build-to-rent communities, just taking, for example, the amenity spaces, it's making sure they've got design resilience. I mean, I'm sure Michael's experienced this. We're spending an awful lot of time testing ergonomically how these spaces will be used for different, not just for different, excuse me, uses, but different times of the day. How you use the spaces in the morning is different to how you use it in the afternoon, and of course the parties, etc., in the evenings. And that is
hard-wearing
quite intense.
fabrics, Russell. Hard-wearing fabrics.
Yeah, hard-wearing fabrics and all of those sort of operational issues. I mean, as designers, our job is to wrap the design around the party program, if you like, that you guys are putting forward. But it's not just it's not just inside, it's outside. And I think just picking up on things that have changed recently, much more focus now on what's happening on outside. And that is partly, I think, a response. I mean, we talked about people leaving cities. I refuse to believe that. That's never happened in history, and it won't happen in the future, in my view. But what is happening is a broader choice, back to what James was talking about. Some people want to live in a more suburban location with more access to the outside and places to work outside, in amenity spaces. Gardens, and why not apartment living in parkland settings? That kind of approach to build to rent. I mean, James was one of the vanguards as well when we did some study tours to the States. We looked about 10 years ago, I think it was now, at a lot of garden style schemes. In the US, they were sort of trying to convert those to city schemes. I suspect they'll be going back to some of those garden style approaches, with walk-up apartments, much larger space, lower construction costs, but really trying to bring the outside nature back into the apartment living. I think that's an area. In terms of flexibility of the apartments, I think Michael's already identified something in terms of the mix. There's definitely an increase in 2-bed, 3-person type of units, and a variety of units. I think for me, what we've noticed in our practice is that in the early days, we were sort of focused on the 2-bed dumbbell and the 1-bed 50 square meters, and there were lots of them, and so forth. Now it's a whole variety. We're designing a variety of apartment layouts to suit different budgets. For example, a 1-bed will be a small, medium and large approach to it, depending on people's choice and budget. And some have balconies and some don't, and some have just balconettes. So I think for me, what's happened post-pandemic really is that, certainly on the design side, there's much more flexibility and different unit types, different home types coming out. But in the amenity spaces, it's very much about design resilience and testing these spaces so that they are intensely used and also can be refurbished and changed and adapted. Yeah,
and I certainly agree with you about the variety of units from an operational point of view, because it is, it's much more to create different versatility of price points, aspects, features. It makes a huge difference from your leasing profiles, and actually appealing to a broader church is what we're talking about in terms of those choices. And it really helps on the leasing side and the occupancy side if you can create a bit of variety for people to change within their life circumstances, which I know is one of James's big drivers too. So, John, just going back to the point around flexibility and amenities, which is your love and drive, what can you do, or what can we do as a sector in terms of thinking about how amenities, the flexibility of those amenities and technology and products and services, and how that impacts on the resilience of our products for future proofing and the different trends that emerge over time?
I think there's a couple of points in there, and the first one is that we should probably celebrate the BTR industry in the last 18 months. The National Build to Rent report from Home Views shows that build to rent residents were much happier with how the pandemic played out and how their homes played out than in the build to sell marketplace. And I think that's been touched on by James, by yourself, Leslie, and Michael, in the hotel style services, having a front of house, having a number of amenities to support and be able to use the properties around the resident in different ways. So it might be that the gym wasn't open for the hardcore pandemic in March last year, but as we move forward, there was a sort of flexibility and more dynamic approach to how we use the buildings than is in a property where you have 100 owners and 25 of them are not there to vote on decisions. So I think firstly we celebrate that part. Secondly, the amenities that scored really highly in that report was the concierge. Everyone likes a greeting. Everyone likes to know someone's there to support them, guide them through whatever they might be facing in the building. But then they loved, exactly as already been described, the communal spaces, both inside and out, the flexibility to have somewhere to work, gyms, events, things that build the community in the building. And all of those can vary. I mean, I'm pretty lucky I get to go to buildings of hundreds of different operators, and whether it be the Vox and the running track on the roof there, or Uncle in Elephant and Castle, which was possibly some of the best views looking back into London from their Sky Lounge. All of these buildings have something quite dynamic about them. And that is that they offer really great services, but they offer a couple of things. They offer basic services brilliantly, and they get those things done well. The power, I had a conversation with a guy at a networking event a while ago, and it was about student accommodation in particular. He said, in a student building, if the hot water went out, you'll probably get a complaint or two after 48 hours. If the Wi-Fi goes out, it'll be 7 seconds before there's a full-on riot. And I think probably in a BTR, we're somewhere in the middle of that, because it's a hotel experience. People want those basics, Wi-Fi, deliveries, a greeting at the front desk, to work brilliantly and simply and cleanly. And whether that comes through the human interaction, the resident apps that are available, or just the different facilities that are out there. Our point of view is making as many of those systems and many of those manual processes that the front of house teams are doing automated. So on a parcel front, if you're receiving, logging, storing, informing, and having to distribute that out to a resident, it's actually quite a manual process. It takes 4.5 minutes on average. If you've got a 100-unit building and you're receiving 35 parcels a day, that's already 2.5 to 3 hours just managing parcels. And yet we've seen there's 100 things that the front of house team should be doing and can be doing, from upselling services, helping the residents, and just making a building function in the way that people want it to, both as somebody living there, but also, you know, as the guys on here have designed it to be lived in.
Yeah. And, you know, that point around there's 100 things to do on the front desk and so forth. I used to work in hotels, and, you know, I often describe it as the swan. And Ella's going to come to you on the consumer experience here. When, you know, when you stay in a 5-star hotel, you see the tip of the iceberg. And actually what you see is the ultimate experience that everybody's working towards. What's underneath is this massive vehicle driving everything that you see above the surface of the waterline. And build to rent is no different. And you're quite right. Good technology, systems, design impacts enormously on the efficiency of the operations and how successful build to rent can be, because the managers and the people on site and the residents get the time and the focus on the service and the elements that matter to their experience, rather than trying to do the doing underneath and spending their time focusing on everything else. So from that point of view, Ellis, tell us a little bit about how, you know, brand can encapsulate that experience and basically, you know, make it all look pretty and Instagrammable while we're all madly, you know, pedaling underneath the iceberg.
Well, thanks for that, Leslie. And I think there's a couple of elements to draw on here. And I think in some ways the key to both, in terms of encapsulating and kind of packaging that experience, is being able to look at some of the industries that you've already mentioned, like hospitality, but also more broadly at, for instance, food and beverage. So, I mean, speaking about some of the changes that have been touched on already, We know that, for instance, residents are going to be probably spending quite a lot more time in a lot of these developments than the conventional sort of 8 a.m. and then back at sort of 7 p.m. So based on that, looking at some of the amenities that are in the building, for instance, if you have a food and beverage offering, then perhaps pivoting away from what might have been previously a kind of evening focused offering, you might be looking at more fulfilling the role that that kind of lunch bar or perhaps that cafe that they might have used at work is, and how to kind of work that into the look and feel of your offer and make it make sense underneath your master brand. And I think the second point in terms of brand experience and kind of drawing something from the wider world of brand here, the kind of key brand attribute that we saw really take a leap last year and this year in particular is the idea of brand trust. And I think for Build to Rent, this is a tremendous opportunity and something we should be really glad of, because this is one area where I think we're set up to really outperform buy-to-let based on the humanity, but also the consistency of those kind of touch points that people have mentioned earlier. For instance, the concierge, I think, James referring to having a landlord that picks up the phone. These are kind of two attributes that are really key to building that idea of trust and building that kind of sense of being able to go to the brand and feeling like they care and understand your needs. And what's been shown over the last 18 months is that if you can kind of build that trust into your brand, then you're actually really strongly positioned for growth. You can convince people to buy new products and services. You can convince people to advocate your brand. I think a 61% level of advocacy. So I think that's a tremendous opportunity for the industry and something that we should be looking at very positively.
So just based on that, Ellis, I mean, has anything fundamentally changed in terms of consumers in this space and the brand trust? Wasn't that always there, or is it somehow accelerated because of the experience that we've had, and that's why Build to Rent has done quite well out of this experience?
Yeah, I mean, so it's always been important, but what we've seen over the last 18 months is that it's actually jumped to the second most important factor in purchasing decisions after price now. So It is quite a marked leap. And I mean, there's a lot of factors that are driving this, but a lot of them are social, but then also based on the pandemic, the kind of sense of precariousness, the sense of isolation that people have felt. They've really looked to their brand worlds and the brands they interact with to kind of support and provide for them in many ways.
It's become more personal somehow.
Absolutely, it's become more personal, and that's where that human aspect of Build to Rent, of being able to kind of have your teams that work with people every day, have a sort of like a more close relationship with your residents, and kind of treating them more holistically as customers. That's a great advantage for the industry and something we should look to lead into more.
Yeah, and I guess this is someone's home. There's not much more personal than home and family and people that where you spend your sanctity and your time. Okay, so let's just go back to one question that we might just ask more broadly is, are there any particular amenities that have or will become more important as a result of the pandemic? So Russell, you touched on, I think you touched on sort of maybe balconies and outside spaces. Is there anything that we're seeing that we haven't seen before? Or is it just a change of the weighting of the way that these sort of things are? If we're talking about the future of apartment living, is there anything that's fundamentally changed, or is it just the weighting of the way things have changed?
I mean, I gave a clue in the earlier point. Really, it's really testing out that same space to be used in different ways. I mean, the minimum space standards can work for a number of different ways. And I think, obviously, and I'm sure many interior design and architects have been looking at different ways for people to work from home within an apartment of varying sizes. And there are a number of ways of doing that. And I think that's what's also spawned a sort of, a different approach to apartment layouts, which has all been good. I mean, what's been really good now is that the industry has got some communities that are up and running and working, and we can start now to do sort of post-occupancy reviews and see how these projects are working, and the points you made about having a broad mix of apartments is increasingly more important. But in terms of the actual ergonomic space use, I think it's very much for us been looking at how we make those spaces work harder. Technology has helped a bit in that as well, in terms of creating these places. But, you know, very much, I mean, I'm a particular advocate that, you know, moving walls, moving elements within an apartment is a nightmare. Homes are not meant to move. And if they start moving, you know, then you get all sorts of operational issues. So it's really about having that very, you know, in some ways what John mentioned, you know, get the basics right and then test how you can use those spaces really well, and complement it with fantastic, obviously, furniture options for people working at home. I know on some of our schemes, the landlords instantly, on the back of the pandemic, started producing much working from home furniture packs than they ever did before. But of course, they are, you know, had those packs been tested, how are they actually used in the apartments? Is the plug socket in the right place? You know, all those sort of nitty-gritty things that have really just got to work. So I think that's really the area. And as for the balcony question, again, it's to have the choice, and that also includes oversizing the apartment so that you can open up a room to the summer and the nature and so forth. Is just as valuable to some than creating a large balcony that you can only use a few days of the year, you know, or God forbid storage, which is another aspect that obviously is dear to everyone's mind in build to rent and who owns a home, is where do you store stuff? Yeah. And I think that is something that, you know, the standards have a sort of, you know, has a figure that you've got to achieve. But it's again about how do you actually use that space? You know, there's no point having space that's too deep that you can't use. You want to be able to use it flexibly. So really testing how you use that storage space ergonomically, you know, whether it's books, whether it's a sewing machine that you want to bring out quickly to do things on and things like that. It's really using that space smartly, not with technology, just good old simple good design. I think is really the thing that's been certainly been testing us since this period of during the pandemic, and I can see it coming through on new schemes a lot now. That's good. Russell, sorry, Michael, I think you've got something to say.
Yeah, I was just going to add, yeah, I agree with a lot of the sentiments, and to answer your original question, I think it's more about the weighting rather than, you know, a complete shift towards new amenity that we've not seen before. And ultimately, you know, viability, if anything, is going to continue to be really challenging for development. So we've got to work harder and, you know, in a more flexible and intelligent way with what we've already got. So I don't think we're going to see, you know, spaces increase, because, like I say, the challenge in these schemes is still there, and is, you know, hopefully market will correct, you know, some of the issues we're seeing with pricing and materials at the moment, but it's only going to become more of a challenge as we move into the future. So I think recognizing that we've got to work harder with what we've got and seeing how those weightings shift. But I think, you know, just to offer up some kind of anecdotal ideas, I do think there's going to be a much greater importance on that different areas that people can work from home in a public space, in a collaborative space. And again, the multifunction enabling may become more creative. So you might start to see resident lobbies, which are also yoga studios, and we might see a shift away from cinema rooms. You know, it might be temporary, it might be short term because people are getting more comfortable about being in confined spaces with one another. But I certainly think at the moment it's probably easier to demonstrate the value in having a fitness studio / yoga studio / environment, which can be a residence lobby, a nice place to relax, a nice place to work from home, a nice place to have a group meeting, but also a place where the fitness classes can be done. And I think that's going to become much more pertinent and influence how we design those amenity spaces. Yeah, in terms of moving forward with the amenity provision in response to what residents are asking for.
Yeah. you know, there's just you mentioned a word there about environment, which is not something that we've touched on. I guess that, you know, that we talked about flexibility and choice and the weighting of the different aspects that are important to residents since the pandemic. Where does ESG or environment sit within this? You know, what are we seeing in the trends? And Ellis, I might just ask you first, and then John, come to you. Just on, you know, from a consumer's point of view, you talk about the brand trust being number 2 in terms of after price, that humanity, that consistency about brand. Where does environment and those sorts of aspects and sit now in the consumer's world and you know, the future of apartment living?
Well, from a brand perspective, it is very important. And it's an interesting one, obviously, due to the nature of build to rent and being institutionally owned. This has got almost 2 layers, because obviously you'll have a corporate ESG agenda probably associated with the parent organization, but then as a platform you might also have your own ESG agenda. So I think that the really important thing is to ensure that you're being consistent in how you're communicating to the consumer. You know, it is something that's of increasing importance, and we see as well, feeding into those kind of brand trust metrics. 81% of consumers now expect brands to have a kind of consistent and credible position on social issues, for instance. So it is important to include these things, but it's also just really important to make sure that you're kind of covering your bases in terms of what's being communicated at each level, what you can credibly back up, what you can provide proof points for, and also what you want to put to the fore and what you want to make a focus of your message, as opposed to perhaps background information that people can find out if they so choose.
The consumer's getting so much more savvy because of access to information, but also we're seeing, I believe, a much more sort of fragmented position on lots of different aspects in regards to environment, because it does come down to a personal, and some of it's quite subjective in many ways. How do you corral that to make sure that, you know, we're appealing to a broad church, as we've sort of said, but also being quite specific and hitting the mark?
Well,
tough question, I know.
Yes, it is a tough question. I think really the key, as I said, is just that kind of consistency. When it comes to kind of demonstrating your ESG credentials, particularly when it comes to environment, there'll be a lot of quite detailed and quite specific metrics that are involved in that. So when it comes to your consumer-facing brand, it's just ensuring that you're delivering the message that you're deriving from those statistics on a kind of consistent basis. So making sure you're picking out what it is you want your consumers to focus on, and ensuring you're kind of putting that across, you know, day by day, month by month, year by year. When it comes to the wider world of that kind of environmental social governance, I think again it's an area where build to rent, especially because a lot of the assets are obviously quite new at the moment, there's a bit of a natural advantage there for the industry as well. So I definitely don't think it's something that people should be sort of scared of approaching, but I also think that the key is just focus and consistency. Don't try and put more in than you can credibly or kind of quickly explain within your offer.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Brand trust comes to mind. So John, you know, you deal a lot with consumers. Obviously, you've got B2B, but you also deal a lot with, you know, the consumer market and understanding. What are you seeing in relation to, you know, these aspects around consumers' choices, and is environment and social rising on the spectrum? You know, is it something that we have to really consider in the future of apartment living?
I think it kind of draws a couple of points together here. Russell a minute ago was talking about within the design of a building, making sure there was space to have our things, our books, our records, whatever it is. One of the interesting things that we can do from the data on our side is we can look at the number of deliveries coming into properties, where they go, and we can split it out depending on the level of information a registrant gives us. we can see that actually deliveries which are growing 12% year on year pre-pandemic, and of course over the pandemic went absolutely crazy for a year, settling back to more regular growth. But we can see that younger generations order nearly double what older generations are ordering, and students order maybe 3 or 4 times. Everything is online. And on an environmental aspect, that has 2 major aspects, I suppose. One is the amount of deliveries coming into a building. And the second is how do you get rid of the waste and the packaging. With my very precise hat on here, when we look at solutions for managing parcels coming into the buildings, it's about making sure every delivery happens on the first time. We often hear that the last inch of deliveries is the hardest or the easiest part. It's actually getting it from Truro to Inverness overnight, which is the tricky part. But we've got a really good mail system in this country, and we know that we can do that. The complicated part is, again, going back to people aren't necessarily in their buildings in the same way that they were a few years ago, is getting it into the hand of the resident. So does it go to a concierge, if there is a concierge? Does it go onto the floor and become a bit of a bonfire of theft objects and trip hazards? Or does the delivery agent have to come back the following day and try to deliver it again and again until it happens? So I suppose from that point of view, there's an environmental aspect there. The second part, which is probably more difficult from our point of view, is how can we then control all of the packaging that comes in? Everyone will have ordered something from Amazon, and everyone will have the anecdote where they've ordered a mug and it comes in a box that you could probably fit 12 bottles of wine in, and maybe a cat as well or something. So that's a real challenge for a property, because we've got things coming in the front door and things going out the back door, and we need to link those 2 pieces together and make it work for the resident as well as the property managers and people running those systems. But it is very much on an ESG-led front there. And as I said, the volumes, they're increasing 12% year on year. So it's something that we're going to see continue to be a problem unless we all sit down and address how we get from the front door to the back door.
You have to ask yourself, though, is how much more can we actually order? Is there a saturation point? I don't know. But that's really interesting perspective. And thank you very much for the figures, because speaking from experience, yes, parcels are a huge part of the day-to-day operations, and get it wrong and you're burying basically in cardboard, and complaints of lost packages and, as you say, trip hazards and you name it. James, what do you from the clients that you work with, what's the sentiment about where to put environment in this whole scenario around future apartment living and design operations?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of chip in on ESG as sort of in terms of big picture. I think we, as a sector, we can be really pleased with the sort of the inherent and sort of built-in head start that we have on some of these issues. This is a new sector. The buildings are new. They are built to modern standards, and they are built by people who have a genuine long-term incentive to keep the maintenance costs low. So they make sure that they're built to a very good quality up front, because they're not just selling them on to someone else who then has the responsibility for any future maintenance problems. So that's one thing that's driving a lot of demand for modular or MMC type of building, which in my experience of those, can really reduce construction traffic and construction waste by about 80% if you do it properly, as well as then, because everything's been fitted in a factory, it's been fitted really well. You've had people sort of fitting insulation to external walls, for example, but being able to walk around the entire module and do it properly, rather than on a windy scaffold in the middle of December. And that has advantages then for acoustic insulation as well as thermal insulation. So I think there are those sort of aspects, and I think it's important to realise that actually residents are very committed to this. That people are asking regularly and more frequently about the environmental credentials of a building they want to come and live in, or they might want to come and live in. And in terms of new development, investors it's certainly top of their agenda now. I mean, it was, it's not that long ago where it was a bit of an afterthought. But it's also, I think, really important to remember that it's not just about the environmental performance of buildings. It's and actually another. I was just listening to John there and just thinking, yes, we've got increasing deliveries, but at least they're coming to a secure place. So it wasn't that long ago, and people who are living in, single landlord, rental or owner occupation, who are, we're getting their parcels sent to the office for them. So delivery vans were going right into the centre of a city to deliver to someone's office building, who then had to carry it back on public transport back to their flat. And then the environmental cost of that was far higher than getting somewhere to delivered straight to your home in a secure way. So I think that is a natural improvement. I'm not sure how, whether anyone's done this precise sort of analysis of those figures, but it's bound to be a positive effect. But I think apart from the environmental aspect, I think we've also got a natural advantage in terms of social and governance, because these are institutional investment assets by and large. They are done with a very long-term incentive behind them. Even if they're not retained by the same owner into perpetuity, they are designed for a similar type of owner to take them over and run them in the same way. So I think governance has a natural head start, and they're not going to get very far in terms of raising money in this day and age without being good at that. And social is the one I wanted to come back. Clearly we're, in comparison with other housing types, this is where the emphasis, I think, historically has been on buy your own home, get your red line, and you've got your protected private defensible space, and it's all yours. Great, but do you interact with your neighbours? Well, it's up to you a bit. And if there's a problem in the whole building, as we're seeing more commonly in anecdotes, that causes some real problems. So not only are there amenity spaces within buildings that you are effectively living within the whole building, and of course you have your private space within that, but you can go in and out as much as you like. And that was always the case. That's, people have been working from home to some extent for a very long time. It's not just the last 2 years, and that was always the concept around that. But it's also that interaction with the wider community as well. And a development I know really well because I was involved in it is Greystars at Greenford. It has the advantage of being a large-scale multi-building development with really generous public realm around in between those buildings alongside a canal. And there's been, even in the last year, there's been a huge program of community events which has attracted people from the surrounding community as well, whether it's a big screen by the canal on a summer's evening to watch a movie, or Wimbledon or the Euros, or some stand-up comedy or some music or something. I heard recently from a former colleague that one of these events has attracted 3,000 people. That's probably 10 times the number of people who are kind of currently living in that development. So that is really good to see that not only are the new residents feeling part of the existing community, but actually it's vice versa as well. And you think back to the original consultation, the public consultation we had, and talking to existing residents in the area, and they just their concept of what we were proposing, or what they imagined in their preconception, was a sort of a fenced off community that was just completely self-contained and would be excluding them. And it's so gratifying to see the reality being what we always intended it to be, which was really bringing people together, being part of the sustainable place in that social sense of the word, as well as everything else.
Thanks, James. It's the proof of concept has just been so solidified by the pandemic, and it's really brought community and people to the fore. So we've only got 10 minutes left, and there's a question here, which I think is a good one. We've had some wonderful innovations in tech come forward during the pandemic to assist operators. What does the panel think is the best change to come forward? Now, I think we could broaden that out and just go around the group and say, what do you think has been one of the we've just covered community, which would have been my answer. But what do you think is one of the biggest impacts that we've had from the pandemic, and also how it influences the future of the way that we design? We've covered quite a few topics, so we might be rehashing, but give it your best shot. I'll start with the top left, Michael.
Yeah, so I'm going to probably repeat something I said earlier. I think the biggest change that will stick and should influence how we do is the remote working, but within the building more than, well, I guess let's phrase it as purpose designed and purpose built working from home. So it's moving away from a bedroom or a living room or an ironing board or some boxes being stacked up to provide a desk. And it's making sure that if people are going to embrace agile working, that their working from home option needs to be a proper ergonomically designed and appropriate space to work. It can't be an ad hoc space in an apartment. So I think it's about, yes, that the apartment is a large part of that, but in line with the ethos of BTR, I think it's about providing those co-working and agile working spaces elsewhere within the building, typically in the amenity. And there's huge benefits to this that I won't go into now because we're rounding up, but just in simple terms of how the building activates with the public realm and at ground floor level. And in terms of planning policy, having a co-working facility and hub on ground floor can do tremendous things for rooting a building in its context. So I think that is a focus area for us that is likely here to stay and will be a large weighting part of discussions to come. Excellent.
Couldn't agree more. Ellis.
Yeah, well, I think actually to give it a little bit of a tech leaning as well, I think one of the most important things that we've discovered from this experience overall is, I guess, just the kind of the familiarity with residents, and that's both from a kind of anecdotal and everyday level, from all of the kind of touch points, them being in buildings more, interacting with people, but also from actually the data that operators have been able to collect on them, and what this means in terms of kind of how we develop our brands going forwards. Is it really should give us a lot more kind of confidence in how we make our experiences more detailed, more tailored, and more differentiated.
Excellent. That's a really good point. We haven't even touched on data. John.
I think mine is probably more for the operator rather than the resident, in that over the past 5 to 10 years, we've all been developing apps for absolutely everything. And as an operator, you've got hundreds of data sources now and hundreds of data control points. And I think where we've all been forced to work from our bedrooms and our living rooms and be remote has meant that we've had to try and join all of that information up. So certainly from our point of view, a number of other organizations that we do some work with, it's about having software development kits at single platforms. You have a resident platform where we can all link into that, and you have one data control point for the building operator, and more importantly, one point of communication going back out to the resident. So everything is branded for that building, that company, and that format, as opposed to me doing parcels, someone doing a heating control, somebody doing taxi ordering, and so on. So that's probably the greatest shift we've had in the last 12 to 18 months. Music
to my ears. Single data points, single systems. Lovely. Russell.
Yeah, I've already spoken a lot about design resilience, but related to data, I mean, technology changes rapidly. The moment you fitted it, it's already out of date. We've all experienced that, and I think what needs to happen in the sector is we need to focus on the infrastructure, the basic principles of the design of these communities. I mean, back to the sustainability question, we're designing buildings now that are going to be around in 30, 50 years time. That's way past any of the government's targets on sustainability, and our investors in these assets are going to want to sell them at about that time. So those schemes that have not been designed today for that flexibility, for that infrastructure, are really going to be devalued hugely in 30, 50 years time compared to the more recent ones that will be coming out at that time. So we need to really plan now for that. in some ways, I admire the way the Tesla car has been developed. You know, that you buy your car and then you get an automatic upgrade through the future. If only we could do something similar with the build-to-rent communities, is that you can build this infrastructure, this chassis, this framework that can take all sorts of different users, treatment, layouts, and so forth, and still survive. And then you just get an automatic upgrade every now and again to keep it up to date. So really, I think the thing that's got to change, and we're obviously all going to hear about it next month at COP26, is we've really got to start thinking for the future about how these buildings and these communities are going to be attractive to, you know, frankly, zero carbon living.
Excellent point. Another excellent point. James, last but not least, 3 minutes.
Well,
2 minutes.
Suffice to say, I agree with everything that's just been said, and I won't repeat any of those. But there was another point which I think I can just about sort of crowbar into this section by, you know, I think the phrase key worker had not been used very much for quite a few years, actually, before the pandemic. And suddenly last year we were hearing about key workers, and everyone naturally thought about health workers and emergency services, but actually it expanded out pretty quickly to delivery drivers, and we're still seeing that, of course, and you know, and all sorts of people. And you know, and I suppose what I wanted to do, as well as convincing, you know, residents to move into our buildings, as well as convincing investors to invest in new developments of these buildings, the third major category of people we need to convince about all of this are local planning authorities, in order to allow more of this to be developed, because it is so much better experience than the existing rental sector, which is, you know, largely buy to let. And one of the reasons it's you know, so we can use the data that we're collecting, and you know, some of that is now coming through in terms of, you know, who lives to build in rent reports, build to rent reports that have come out through a joint effort between UKAA and BPF, and you know, updated versions of that are due to be out, you know, either at the end of this year or the beginning of next. And it's really useful information to counter some of the misconceptions you often get about who are these buildings for. It's a question that we always get asked on, you know, by planning officers, housing officers, who's going to live in this building? And I always say, well, I don't think you'd ask a house builder that question. You'd just be glad that they're building houses. So I'm not sure why that we're particularly sort of, people don't quite it indicates to me that people don't quite understand the product. So I think it gives us an opportunity to use this data to actually explain to people what it is, why it's beneficial. You know, here are the resident satisfaction ratings, and here is how we integrate the affordable housing, which is, you know, if you do it in the way that is best suited, which is sort of an intermediate discounted market rent type of product, which is really flexible as people's circumstances change in the future, then that should be a really positive message to local planning authorities. And that's something, you know, as a challenge to the whole sector, we need to keep focused on, and not just assume that it's going to be that everyone understands it, because they don't.
Thank you, James, and I couldn't agree more with all of those points. So we've got 1 minute, so I'm just going to round up. So today we've heard around a broader choice, a broader church. We've heard about brand trust. We've heard about flexibility, variety, community, obviously the importance of flexibility and design resilience with amenity, and those 5 points that you all just made around key workers or occupants, infrastructure, tech systems, data, and remote working, all incredibly important points, and very much appreciate your perspectives. I hope you got something from it. I hope our listeners got something from it. But I have to say that the 3 key points that I take away was celebrate the sector, wear a shining knight, and party on. Thank you very much. Take care.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.